So it's a great pleasure to host Dr. Asim Gazi for the M.Dot webinar today. He is a very amazing rising star in our mHealth Training Institute universe. He is a recent graduate of the mHealth Training Institute. He graduated with Umar Inan, so another superstar in this area of wearables. Then he went to another superstar, to Susan Murphy's lab at Harvard, and right now he is working on decision making for JITAIs, but dealing with uncertainty, which is a topic Susan has been interested in for a long time. So he has suitably been awarded by NSF with a graduate fellowship, then from NIH for his K99. So he has the blessings from both sides of the world, the science from the traditional science engineering side as well as the health side. So let's turn it over to Asim to hear about the wonderful work he has been doing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Santosh. Thank you so much. Awesome. So what I'm going to do, how this is going to be structured, is I'm going to first motivate decision making for JITAIs. Then we're going to talk about uncertainty, and then finally we're going to deep dive into this decision point scheduling problem. And of course, before I get into anything, and this is somewhat of an outline too, the work that I'm going to show today is the result of collaborations across several institutions with many people. The work that I'm going to show on the decision point scheduling, SigmaScheduling as we call it, that's going to be the folks in this first row are the key collaborators on that project, along with others. And then the work that I'll briefly show from my PhD involved quite a few individuals across the board at Georgia Tech and Emory University. So the key problem here when we're talking about and motivating just-in-time adaptive interventions, or these systems that can provide interventions in a timely and personalized or adaptive manner, is that the reality is a standard of care may help, where an individual may hopefully, if they're struggling with some maybe mental illness or a chronic illness of some sort, or they're trying to get preventive care, they may visit with a therapist every week, or may get on a telehealth call every week with a psychotherapist, an occupational therapist, for example, for post-stroke rehabilitation, and so on. One of the key challenges we're faced with when it comes to this standard of care is that synchronous clinical support always struggle simply due to the mismatch in the availability of clinicians and their time with the amount of time we as individuals live in our everyday life. And I thought this quote here from a clinician scientist in a recent paper really captures it quite well, that 99% of our time is spent on our own outside the context of synchronous clinical care. And that reminded me, when I saw that quote, it reminded me of an interaction I had very early on in my PhD that really helped set the stage for a lot of the work that I'm really passionate about. And that was, I was collecting data from individuals who suffered at some point in time a psychological trauma. And certain individuals within that study, certain participants developed post-traumatic stress disorder after that, and some did not. And in this case, I was actually talking to a participant who was actually the same age as me. And she was describing how earlier in her life, her first year of her undergrad, she was molested in an elevator. And from then on, anytime she would even hear a ding that sounded like what you would hear when you get on an elevator, when the elevator doors open, her body could go through a full-blown stress response that was incredibly difficult to self-regulate. And that really depicts what problem we're really, what's the overall issue that we're really trying to address here. Because if I ask you, how often do you come across an elevator in your everyday life? Or how often could you potentially be reminded of an elevator? You realize that we really need support during all of this remaining time. And that's where mobile health interventions are really promising, right? And some of these mobile health interventions you may already be familiar with from previous webinars and all the content available through MDOT and the mHealth Training Institute. I can show you one that we're working on right now for individuals who are in the chronic post-stroke phase. So they've suffered a stroke and they're stroke survivors in that. And they're in the chronic phase of recovery where we're helping remind them and encourage them and give them tips on how they can use their affected arm for upper limb rehabilitation, affected arm in everyday life. So you have these behavioral interventions that could potentially be delivered throughout one's daily life. What's really interesting, and I'll touch on this just a bit earlier in the talk, is there's also interventions that may not necessarily require an individual to actively engage with that particular intervention. And this is really exciting, because if you're familiar with the just-in-time adaptive intervention literature, we're really worried about vulnerability and receptivity. So I gave you an example of vulnerability earlier on with the patient with post-traumatic stress disorder, where she could potentially all of a sudden be reminded of that incident in an elevator and go through this full-blown stress response. But if you're relying on a behavioral intervention, you're also relying on the individual to be receptive to that intervention, for them to receive it and be able to consciously regulate in that moment. And what's exciting is that they're really nascent intervention approaches, totally non-invasive. For example, here's one that's commercialized that you can deliver via earbuds, non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation, which I'll dive into in a sec, that circumvents the need for receptivity. So there's this, confluence, or it's the time, it's very ripe for the development of potential approaches to deliver these interventions intelligently in everyday life. This challenge where the exact same intervention I could potentially deliver to an individual at one point in time and a separate point in time. For example, stimulating one's vagus nerve or delivering a behavioral intervention via an app. And I'm going to briefly introduce a little bit of notation just for the people who are familiar, where the people who are familiar with control systems engineering, you would call this sort of intervention maybe a controlled input variable or control action. And for the folks that are more familiar with reinforcement learning, you would consider this an action. So we're sort of formulating the problem space here, where you have this same exact intervention that at different points in time could result in different outcomes. For example, I could send someone a push notification to tell them to take a deep breath. And at one point in time, they really appreciate that because they are on the verge of really feeling some form of acute stress response. And we caught them right in time where they said, oh, nice. Yeah, this reminder really helped me. On the flip side, you could send that notification when the individual is relaxed on accident. The individual is sitting in their on their couch watching a movie, and you send them that notification, they get upset. Like, why are you bothering me right now? I don't need to be taking a deep breath or anything like that. And so from a control system standpoint, sometimes this is called a cost for a particular intervention or state that the individual is in, or in reinforcement learning, a potential reward of sending that intervention. But what's key here is why these two time points resulted in so different of a response for the same exact intervention is that actually the individual is in a different state in time, right? And that's the notation for that. Depending on an individual's state, an intervention may or may not have the desired efficacy. And that's really where the sensing component or the adaptive intervention component really comes into play, that we're not just worried about delivering these interventions that can be provided in everyday life, but we're doing so with information from the individual to tailor that intervention in the best way possible. And so, of course, a classic approach is to do so using ecological momentary assessments. You survey an individual in their everyday life rapidly throughout time, and you can potentially capture certain changes and provide interventions accordingly. Where my work really lies is on the passive sensing side, where you can also potentially use information from, for example, your smartwatch. For example, underneath an Apple Watch or a Samsung smartwatch or whatever smartwatch that you use, you have particular sensors that can capture certain cardiovascular information using simply optical-based measurements, lights, LEDs, and photodiodes. So shooting light and seeing how much you get in return, and that's going to vary depending on the blood volume pulse to your wrist or your finger or whatnot. And of course, you have more futuristic sensors. You have smart rings that are becoming more popular now, as well as e-tattoos and other flexible electronics. Or even, and we'll talk about this at the very end of the talk, sensors in an electronic toothbrush to help understand how well you're brushing. And so now you have this situation where you could potentially capture quite a bit of data from these mobile health sensors, and you have the opportunity to intervene. But really, we need to connect these two together. We need to figure out ways we can use the actual data from wearables and other mobile health sensors to infer and track changes in that individual state, right? Because we know that the effects of an intervention are going to be state dependent, and then accordingly model the effects and adapt these timely interventions we now are familiar with, such as non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation or push notifications on one's phone. And that's really where my work exactly sits, and I call it agentic wearables, and I'll explain why, where I use this term to basically illustrate that what I'm really interested in is making wearables and other mobile health systems have the agency to not only just collect data and store it and then report it back to a clinician at those once-a-week appointments. I'm really working on these problems where we want to go one step beyond and say, hey, the clinician support that an individual gets is potentially irreplaceable. This is something we really recommend individuals seek support through. But for all that time in the intermediary, what sort of support is available? Well, we could potentially use these measurement technologies to autonomously inform interventions such that they're delivered in everyday life in an intelligent manner. And what does that actually entail, right? Sounds cool, great, awesome. How would this actually work? This is where my research foci really lie, are in these three components, where state inference is really this game of taking this raw physiological sensor data, such as the photoplethysmogram data, that optical measurement that I talked about, and saying, well, hey, I'm interested in underlying cardiovascular states of an individual. A simple example, heart rate variability, but things even more complicated than that and more physiologically specific. And once I have this information about an individual state, well, maybe I have some predictive model of how I think an individual will respond to an intervention. So this dynamic modeling, or a hot term right now is digital twinning, that takes these states inferred, some knowledge about the effects of an intervention, and says, hey, if you give the intervention right now, you can have a lot of reward, meaning we are going to maximize the outcome, desired outcome, or reduce cost. And based on that, you make some decision about how you could potentially intervene on an individual's life during their everyday life in an autonomous and supportive and intelligent manner. Of course, there's challenges, right? This is a hard problem to make autonomous decisions in everyday life. And so I'm going to highlight a few areas where my research has contributed, especially in this area, as Santosh really well put it. That's really where my research lies, is making decisions with some knowledge of the uncertainty so that we can make uncertainty-informed decisions autonomously, so these systems can do so. And so one of the key challenges, if you're familiar with passive sensing, is it's actually very commonplace. You know, I remember talking to a few friends who are not familiar with this mobile health setting. And I mentioned to them that, oh yeah, we have to really deal with quite a bit of data corruption. By data corruption, I mean, you know, this, you know, one individual's garbage is another individual's treasure, right? So what I mean by that is from these portions of this photoplethysmogram signal, this PPG signal that's capturing the blood volume pulse, you can see that maybe in this middle portion of the signal, you have this deflection reflection that you get, where every time the heart pumps out blood and you get this pulse waveform reaching your finger or your wrist, you get this deflection that allows you to calculate a heart rate, among other things. But for these two portions, and this is actually a really representative signal, I just pulled up data and just created a figure accordingly. You have quite a bit of corruption that does not allow you to capture physiologically relevant information. It's really commonplace. 30 to 40% is actually not bad. If the individual is awake and moving, this is actually not bad at all. And so we have to be able to manage this situation of dealing with these artifacts or corruptions when it comes to physiological data, extracting physiologically relevant states, or we're going to end up with a garbage in, garbage out situation. And so just to briefly talk about some of my work I've done in this area, some of the standard approaches. So what you're going to do first, if you're familiar, bandpass filtering is essentially this frequency domain technique. It's essentially, frequency domain is all about trying to take a signal and isolate the components of it depending on the speed of its changes. You can think also, if you're a musical person, the tones of a signal. So when you increase the bass on your speaker, your low pass filter, you're amplifying the lower frequencies of the signal. So with a band pass filter, what you're doing is you're allowing for a certain band of frequencies to go through the filter, and everything outside of those tones or those frequencies in your signal, you're cutting out. Of course, this is not enough. As you can see, you still see quite a bit of corruption, but it does allow you to extract heart rate information a little better, where you're not dealing with these sorts of lower frequency variations that may make it difficult for an algorithm to detect heart rate, for example. And so classic approaches are now going to use one of two things typically. They're going to use motion artifact detection, whereby you will have an inertial measurement unit. So something that measures accelerometry, a gyroscope, so linear acceleration, so movement basically. And they're going to have a separate sensor that measures that movement. So then when someone's moving too much and you know that the signal is likely to be corrupted, you can potentially now flag that portion of the signal and say, oh no, this is going to be corrupted. Or high amplitude. So that typically happens also with motion artifacts, where the signal all of a sudden is way too large for it to be anything physiologically relevant. But what we can see is what? These standard approaches still leave these portions of data where you're not going to get a good heart rate. And if you're using that heart rate to then inform decision making, again, garbage in, garbage out. And so I'll briefly touch on a little bit of the ideas here, and I'm not going to dive into it too much, but you can look into some of these papers if you're interested. The real sort of novelty with some of the methods that we've developed is to take these cardiovascular and respiratory data and say, well, hey, we know something about the physiology. We know that even though an individual's breathing is going to slightly differ from breath to breath, or their heart, the way the signal is going to look like, the cardiovascular signal is going to look like, is going to be a little bit from beat to beat, it's going to exhibit some similarity, some self-similarity. Why not take advantage of that? Why not form some form of template or understand the regularity of the signal and leverage that to try and identify when the signal is no longer regular or it doesn't match a particular template that a signal should look like? And so to give you some idea what I mean, imagine you have a quality respiration signal here where the individual is breathing in, breathing out, and then you have a corrupted signal. Well, if you take the power spectral density, again, you're looking in this frequency domain, well, things are looking a lot like crazy irregular. You have higher frequency information, lower frequency information. So what happens is when you take the power spectral density, this Fourier transform sort of work, if you're familiar. What you end up getting with a highly irregular signal is something that you would expect with like noise, where you have this distributed power across quite a few frequencies. While on the other hand, when the individual for like, let's say 10 seconds is breathing at a relatively regular pace, you're going to have a more concentrated frequencies. It's like, for example, if I am going to talk the same way for 5 seconds, you can imagine that the tones that I'm using at that moment are going to be much more concentrated than if I'm going up and down in tone, or multiple people are talking. I think that's even a better example. Multiple people are talking, you really don't know what you're wanting to capture. And so what we can do is compute some form of score, some confidence score based on the ratio of how, or based on the concentration of this power spectral density, where here the specific measure is just a sum of two maximum neighboring values divided by the total sum. So you can imagine as something becomes more concentrated, this signal quality index goes up, and as it becomes less concentrated, more noisy, it goes down. And so what's really cool is even something as simple as just estimating a breathing rate. We showed in a quite large data set, multiple postures, hour of data per participant, 15 participants, where we had individuals breathe through a ground truth spirometer. And this is not even individuals talking or doing intense activity. And what you find is beforehand, when you're computing these Bland-Altman limits of agreement, so when you're creating these Bland-Altman plots, which I'll explain. So on the y-axis, what you have is your estimate, whatever method you're using, minus the ground truth, so the spirometer estimate of respiration rate. And then on the x-axis, you have the average. And so what you want is that these errors to be small. So you want the plot to look smaller vertically. You want these limits of agreement to be tighter, because what this is trying to tell you is that 95% chance, from a frequencies perspective, 95% chance you're going to have an error of less than, let's say, 5 breaths per minute here, which is kind of not so great. Exactly my point. Where after you use our approach, where it's completely computationally reproducible, we're doing this completely automated approach that's improving upon the status quo. This is the status quo where you're just looking for motion artifacts or high amplitude removal. You get a 32% improvement in the Bland-Altman limits of agreement simply by taking these signal quality, computing these signal quality indices and saying, hey, I don't want a garbage in, garbage out situation. I'm going to ignore data where I know that the signal quality is far too low in an automated way. And so sort of the key conclusion from that work, and I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A, is that automated signal quality assessments can help address this challenge of the garbage in, garbage out when it comes to this passive sensing especially. A second source of uncertainty that's really difficult, especially when we're dealing with interventions that are really nascent, such as that non-invasive VNS that I promised I'd quickly dive into, is that we really don't even know sometimes what to expect of these interventions. Do we have models that can even predict the effects of these interventions based on an individual state? And so in this specific case, really a question that we had was, can this form of non-invasive nerve stimulation, electrical stimulation, help individuals cope with stress? So this was actually one of the targets or the goals of that study that I mentioned for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. Can we help them in a just-in-time manner respond to their stress, cope with stress in a fully automated way, passive intervention, biological intervention? And so to really understand what we're getting at, let's first do a quick overview of what we mean by stress. So here, this is oftentimes what we typically think of when we're thinking of the response of the body to a stressor. You have, of course, there's going to be unconscious perception that takes place within the brain. And then you end up getting this consciously accessible response where, let's say, if you send someone an EMA or a survey, that person says, oh, wow, I'm stressed, 7 out of 10 or 3 out of 10 or whatever on a scale of 0 to 10, how stressed they are. But in reality, you have simultaneously a full-blown bodily response that takes place with stress, and especially in cases such, for example, such as that individual with post-traumatic stress disorder that I had the opportunity to meet, you have full-blown bodily response that basically takes over everything. And it's incredibly difficult for them to at this point, consciously regulate, simply because their entire body, their heart is beating fast. It's beating in a forceful manner. They're having trouble breathing, and so on and so forth. And that takes place through these other bodily systems where slow changes throughout the body, the cortisol response, for example, takes place with this HPA axis. And then a lot of the fast changes, you're talking about changes in breathing, sweating, heartbeat, and so on and so forth, are really dictated by the autonomic nervous system. And so for just-in-time stimulation, and yes, the elevator here reminds us of that story, we're really worried about this autonomic nervous system, where what's really fascinating is that this vagus nerve is one of the primary nerves. It's the 10th cranial nerve. It's connected directly from the brainstem to the heart and throughout the body, that acts as this information highway, also as a mediator of parasympathetic, the parasympathetic response of the autonomic nervous system. And what I mean by that is you have two branches of this really complicated system here, but to simplify things, you have two branches. You have the sympathetic, or the fight or flight branch, and you have the parasympathetic, or the rest and digest branch. And what non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation is really trying to get at is trying to provide reinforcements to the parasympathetic branch through stimulation of the vagal nerve, which now acts as this mediating pathway to elicit this rest and digest effect, to potentially, and that was our hypothesis, to downregulate the fight or flight response associated with stress, or at least help with that imbalance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. And what was really exciting is that within the past decade, these forms of non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation have started to become commercialized, and also FDA cleared for other indications. But what we didn't know is how this would work for stress. And so some of the work that my PhD built upon looked at the overall effects over long periods of time on individuals who, again, suffered psychological trauma, some with PTSD, some without PTSD. And what's really interesting about this study is that this was done, the evaluation of non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation was done in this double-blind, randomized, sham-controlled trial, where neither the researchers there collecting data, administering VNS, nor the participants knew which form. Were they getting an active VNS? Were they getting the real deal? Or were they getting a sham stimulation? And sham stimulation was just a low-frequency stimulation that didn't penetrate to the vagus nerve, versus the active stimulation is one that's purported to do so, right? And so what we find based on this study is that you end up getting not only just subjective responses, which you could take a look at the papers for more details, but you get these physiological responses. You get this reduction in heart rate in the active group compared to the sham group. You get this reduction in breathing rate in the active group compared to the sham group when they're receiving stimulation after recalling a traumatic memory, which is really quite fascinating, because we know this is likely not due to a placebo response, because the participants didn't know, and the individuals conducting the research, we had no clue which form of stimulation was delivered, because the stimulation device looked exactly and operated the exact same. It was just the electrical stimulation which was felt by the participants, and any participants who had previously received any form of neuromodulation were excluded from the study. So they didn't know what to expect. Both ways, they felt a tingling. But what we lacked is really a quantitative understanding of, well, hey, cool, we see this 2 to 3 minutes later. But if we want to try and help someone cope with that immediate, instantaneous stress response in everyday life, we really need to understand what the time course looks like of this response. Does heart rate actually skyrocket right after stimulation and then a minute afterwards come back down? Well, then that might not actually help people. We want to understand what are the delays involved here, and how does this intervention's response actually manifest over time? And so what we did was we fit these dynamic models. We built these models to address that uncertainty in how these interventions take effect, or how this intervention takes effect. And so this was, again, that same set of 2 studies done with individuals with and without PTSD, where individuals were exposed to 3 conditions, MVNS or sham, I should say, where they were recalling traumatic memories that were narrated to them. So they would sit with a researcher and go through whatever traumatic event that took place in their life, and this was narrated back to them via headphones, or a neutral condition, or the stimulation. And so what we thought about was, well, hey, these potential stresses and interventions act as inputs to an underlying autonomic nervous system, which then manifests changes throughout the body, these cardiovascular and respiratory changes, which then we estimate using these signal processing and machine learning methods to extract certain physiologically relevant markers to understand what those effects of the interventions are. Well, hey, this translates quite nicely to this control systems engineering perspective of you have controlled inputs, these controlled variables or actions. You have an underlying state that's changing over time, and the changes in that state are manifesting as these changes in outputs. We can fit these models to try and learn something about this underlying system and how these interventions and potential stressors affect the markers and the underlying system of interest. And so what we did was we first validated these models. I'm not going to dive into too many details, but of course, I'm happy to answer any questions, where we first ensured that these models have some predictive validity. So we didn't just fit the model and say, woohoo, yeah, great. We actually tested, can they predict forward the effects, whether or not they're interventions, like whether they're stressors or whether they're interventions or at baseline. And sure enough, what we find is that these models pass established forecasting tests such as the mean test and naive test, which I can dive into if you're interested. And what's really cool is you can see that you have some ability. The green is the model predictions. This is changes in heart rate from a baseline, changes in respiration rate, and the real data underneath. And you see that these models can predict forward the effects of interventions. And when there's no intervention, they can predict forward the data. And what's really cool is you can actually forecast using these models up to 25 seconds into the future. They still beat these baseline tests that ensure that the models are capturing something about the dynamics that's actually relevant to the time course of the changes in those output markers. And so what we did was we said, okay, well, we have these validated models. Let's go back to our original question. What would the effects of just-in-time VNS be? And what I'm going to show you are simulation results, but they're informing current development, actually, of designing closed-loop stimulation. And what we find, so this is a visualization of underlying states. So this is if you're familiar with principal component analysis, everything that we did in this work, by the way, was computationally reproducible. Nothing was using random seed stochastic methods, nothing like that. And we did that to really ensure that all of our results were computationally reproducible and really had some scientific value. And so there are, of course, many other fancy techniques for dimensionality reduction, but we intentionally use PCA here just to look at these changes, these underlying changes. And what we find, we perform these simulations of when, let's pretend each individual's model is exposed to trauma recall. So they're recalling a traumatic memory, this sort of digital twin-like model. And that's taking place for 30 seconds. And then all of a sudden you deliver that vagus nerve stimulation, this non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation. What would happen? Well, what we did was we did these sorts of stimulations, and we did this for a neutral condition as well as a comparison. We did these sorts of simulations for both the models fit to active groups data as well as sham groups data for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. And what we find really fascinatingly enough, is sure enough, when the active groups models are simulated to get that stimulation, within 10 to 15 seconds, you get this flattening of the stress curve response, where typically, if you imagine going along this horizontal axis, you have greater changes in the acute physiological stress. You get this flattening of the curve, this down regulation you can kind of see in the video, where as soon as the stimulation is turned on and it starts to take effect within 10 to 15 seconds, you get this, boom, flattening of the curve. But with the sham stimulation, you don't get that. And so that was really interesting to see, and gives us some hope for potential just-in-time VNS sort of intervention in everyday life, especially in the context of acute stress in general. And this was really exciting for us because these sorts of results actually informed the FDA issuing breakthrough designation for non-invasive VNS for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. And this, of course, was a highly collaborative effort as well with industry, not only just with clinician scientists in the School of Medicine at Emory. Cool. So the key takeaway there is we can build dynamic models to try and account for that uncertainty when we talk about predicting the effects of a nascent intervention. And so now what we're going to end this talk with is a deep dive into a final source of uncertainty that I've focused on. And that is, okay, great, you're dealing with this garbage in, garbage out situation, but now you're going to make some prediction of an underlying state or some quantity, such as prediction of when a behavior is likely to occur, estimation of an individual's psychological stress from physiological markers, for example. These predictions are not going to be perfect. Oftentimes in mobile health settings, we're dealing with a situation where we're having sensor-informed predictions. You're not dealing with 90, 95% accuracy. You're dealing with 80, 85%, 70, 75% accuracy, which is better than chance, maybe in detecting a 0 or 1 state, binary state. But you now have this situation where you're wrong a lot, a non-negligible amount of times. How do we handle these imperfect predictions? And that's exactly what my K99 is really dealing with, and the future research from here is we need to be able to quantify the uncertainty in predictions of state and use those quantifications of uncertainty to inform decision-making for just-in-time adaptive interventions, or these closed-loop systems, or these agentic wearables, whatever you want to call them. And the basic idea really here is that instead of just using the prediction to inform your decision-making, so, whether or not, let's say, pretend that you want to do a detection of psychological stress, where you're saying, the person can be either stressed or not stressed. You're not just saying, which one is more likely, and then go with that, 1 or 0. Or, for example, you're trying to estimate the timing that someone is going to perform a behavior, or any sort of continuous variable. You're not just worried about the number itself, but also sort of a predictive distribution, how confident you are, the uncertainty, sort of the variability in that prediction, so that you can use that to make better decisions. And sort of the classic example I provide is that if you're in a context, for example, such as the detection of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, or even something maybe less extreme, such as the detection of someone's craving, whether the person is craving a substance. I would argue that if I was 51% confident that someone was craving a substance versus 99% confident that an individual was craving a substance, I think I would intervene differently when comparing 99% versus 51% confident. That's the idea here, is can we quantify uncertainty and use that to make better decisions? And the example that I'm going to dive into is this just-in-time adaptive intervention. And this is work really spearheaded by Vivek Shetty, who many of you all know is really the fearless leader of the mHealth Training Institute, or one of the fearless leaders of the mHealth Training Institute, where this oralytics just-in-time adaptive intervention is really trying to target and improve individuals' brushing behavior. And really, there are really surprising statistics. This is one that surprised me, for example, that individuals fail to brush their teeth. So many, a third of individuals fail to brush their teeth at least twice daily. And there are many factors at play that not only affect whether or not the individual brushes, but how well the individual brushes. And that's where this oralytics just-in-time adaptive intervention really comes into play here, is not only trying to just deliver reminders, but then also tips and encouragement, and trying to provide some guidance before the individual is going to brush on potentially, hey, maybe you should spend more time on that left quadrant, left upper quadrant, or maybe you should focus on flossing this time around, or so on and so forth, where it's not just reminding the person to brush, but also encouraging them to properly brush. And this is really key. And so what was really a surprise talking to other individuals on the team is that we went through this whole design process of designing a reinforcement learning algorithm to try and intelligently deliver these interventions. And what we find out is that even just scheduling when these decision points or when potential interventions could be delivered turned out to be a challenge that we dealt with even before dealing with what type of intervention to deliver. And what I mean by that is this. I'm going to show you a good example first to kind of get everyone on the same page. What I'm showing here are real participants brushing data from the first deployment of Oralytics. And so I'm just showing morning brushing for this participant, where these rows of data, horizontal, if you go traverse the horizontal axis, you're talking about time of day. So like 4 a.m., 9 a.m., 2 p.m. And each row of data is a different day's brushing data. And what we show here is that, well, these participants were asked before the study began, well, hey, when do you typically brush on weekdays and on weekends? And based on what the users provided, or the participants rather, based on the information provided by the participants, what now happened was these decision points were scheduled accordingly. So these decision points are when an intervention could potentially be delivered. And I'll give a more formal definition in a sec. But the idea here is, okay, if the individual brushes, they say they typically brush at 7 a.m., then what we're going to do is make sure that these interventions, if an intervention is going to be delivered, gets delivered at 6 a.m. to help provide that tip, so that not only potentially remind them to brush, but even if they were going to brush anyways, provide that tip or encouragement to brush in a more proper manner. And so in this case, you have no problem, because what these asterisks show are the true brush times for that individual. And sure enough, you see that they brushed every single time after these decision points. So that's great. And that could potentially imply, yeah, maybe the intervention helped, but then also, even if no intervention was delivered, they still brushed after, which is great, because then if an intervention were to be delivered, that intervention could impact or influence the actual behavior. This is really key. And this is the formal definition of decision points. Of course, you can take a look at this paper on JITAIs to dive into other components and their definitions, but the points in time at which an intervention decision must be made for a just-in-time adaptive intervention or a JITAI. And so the real goal here is we want to schedule these decision points before an individual is likely to brush. Here's the problem, right? Is that not everyone really knows when they're going to brush a priori before a study. And so now here's an example of an individual who told us, hey, I'm going to brush at 10 a.m. So we scheduled these decision points at 9 a.m. And what you end up having is this individual's brushing way before the decision point. So yeah, maybe they still brushed, but that encouragement or that tip to brush in a more proper manner is not falling on deaf ears, because the individual's already brushed. They might have gone to work, whatnot. So now you have all these wasted opportunities that you could have intervened. And the key thing here is that unless you're sending an intervention on the individual's brush, you gotta forecast the behavior in advance. Because if you're waiting to detect the behavior, it might be too late to actually send that intervention in certain cases, in this study, right? So that's why you have to predict forward when the individual is going to brush and accordingly schedule decision points. And in this case, we trusted that the individuals knew when they would brush and found out that this is really not the case. And it's not just a one-off case. We had almost a quarter of participants, 30%, so less than 70% coverage for almost a quarter of participants, because of this issue, that decision points were scheduled the same fixed duration before predicted brush times for all participants. What is going on here? What are we dealing with? Well, you can think that these surveys or these questionnaires that the individuals are filling out to tell us when they brush, this acts as almost like a prediction, right? It's a prediction of when that behavior is likely to occur. What's happening here is that decision points, these T sub K, or you could just think decision points, are scheduled the predicted time plus some fixed duration. So in this case, for deployment 1, it was supposed to be scheduled 1 hour before the predicted brush time, all decision points for every individual. And clearly this is a problem, right? Because For some individuals, this could work really well. They have very highly regular behavior. But then for other individuals, you have much more irregular behavior. And if you're just stuck with using this fixed duration, no matter what you do, you can increase this to -3 hours, you can increase the magnitude. And if here you're using a negative number because you would prefer that the intervention be sent before the actual target behavior. So you could do -2 hours, -3 hours, and maybe you fix this issue. But then now you go back to an issue with this other individual where you're scheduling the decision points way in advance. And that individual could potentially forget about what you told them in the intervention by the time they come to brush. And so what our idea here is instead saying, well, hey, if we're dealing with variability and uncertainty in predictions, we can come up with a relatively simple but principled approach to account for this uncertainty. So rather than varying that fixed duration that I showed you before, that, oh, do we send it 30 minutes before predicted behavior, 1 hour before? What we're going to do instead is say, hey, if we can quantify the variability in someone's brushing, then instead we can vary this fixed value that represents how many measures of uncertainty before the predicted behavior we're going to send this potential, or we're going to schedule this decision point. In other words, what do I mean by that? I mean that when someone's behavior is more predictable, this sigma, this uncertainty is going to be smaller. And so for the same value of C, imagine C is 1. This small value, now you're just going to schedule the decision point maybe 30 minutes before. But if someone's behavior is far more uncertain, highly variable, then this value increases, the sigma K, meaning the uncertainty in that instance of a prediction, increases. And so for the same design, for the same critical value, you're now going to send interventions earlier. Because you're more uncertain about the behavior, you're going to be more conservative and say, okay, hold on, let me be a little careful here, and give me some breathing room. Let me send this intervention earlier just so I can make sure I cover enough of the desired target behavior with my decision points. So if you're less uncertain, you come closer, more uncertain, you go farther. And that's the idea. We'll return to this critical value C and how you would select this at the very end of the talk, after I hopefully convince you that this is all worth it. So I'm going to show you results first, and then we'll talk about how you would do this in practice. But that's the idea, exactly what I explained. You have a prediction of when the target behavior is likely to occur, and then you just, boom, use the uncertainty in that prediction to say, oh, I'm more uncertain. Let me schedule further in advance. Or I'm less uncertain, actually. Let me schedule right there to really milk the effects of this potential intervention, get it as close to that predicted behavior as possible, because the individual's behavior is pretty regular. And so really the key now is I talked about the prediction, but then how do you quantify uncertainty? Great, it sounds great. This is a great way potentially to schedule interventions that accounts for this variability. How do you go about doing this? I'm going to first talk about just using participant-provided times, nothing crazy or fancy, as I'm going to emphasize in a sec. All we're doing is imagine the situation where the individual told you, hey, I brush at 10. And so you're scheduling these decision points. But then as the study goes on, you're collecting data every day. In an online manner, you're collecting this data every day of when they actually brushed. Well, guess what? Now you have these errors from the past. So you have these predictions given by the individual of when they would typically brush, and you have errors in the predictions. Well, hey, these errors, these are residuals. We can quantify the standard deviation of these residuals based solely on past data from that individual. And then what we can do is actually form a standard error for a prediction interval, not a confidence interval, but a prediction interval. And so what we're dealing with here is we're trying to form some estimate of this distribution, this predictive distribution, how certain we are in these user-provided brush times. And we're doing so based on past errors. If these errors are huge, then you're going to have a high uncertainty. If the errors are small, then you're going to have a low uncertainty. And that's exactly what this measure quantifies. And that's what I want to emphasize here is there was no machine learning or anything involved in this specific situation. So many of us who work with micro-randomized trials or just-in-time adaptive interventions that are trying to schedule decision points, you can do this out of the box as long as you can get data on the behavior of an individual as it's happening. So by the next day, you have the previous day's data. So it's not too intensive. You just have every night you get some data. You could update this measure of uncertainty as the study goes on and accordingly schedule your decision points to make sure you don't miss out on the opportunity to intervene when you need to. And so how does this work? Does it work well? Well, I'm going to explain how these plots work because they might be new to many of you. But what I want to emphasize before I dive into this is at a high level, these curves are highly analogous to receiver operating characteristic curves that you would look at if you were dealing with a detection model, for example, of a disease or some state, where typically on these ROC curves, you have the true positive rate plotted on the y-axis and you got the false positive rate plotted on the x-axis. And the idea is for the same false positive rate, you want a higher true positive rate, right? Because you want, of course, you could increase the false positive rate to 1. You could just guess everything as positive and you would get true positive rate of 1. But really, when you know your model is doing well, when you know your algorithm is doing well, is when you could reduce the false positives while maintaining a high true positive rate. And so better is going to be further to the top left corner. What we're dealing with here is a very similar trade-off, actually. On the y-axis, what we're plotting is that the percentage of the sample, the percentage of the 68 individuals who have the desired coverage of brush time. So the decision points were scheduled prior to the brush times. For what coverage? This desired coverage, so 80%. So imagine you go into a study and say, hey, I want to make sure that for every participant, at least 80% of their target behavior is covered. How much of that sample do you achieve that goal for? And of course, you could be super, super conservative. You could just send these interventions way in advance and you're going to get a really high value of coverage. You're going to get everyone getting that desired coverage of brush times. But really what you're really looking for is, can I get a shorter delay for still bigger bang for my buck? Can I still get a higher subsample? Can I still get more participants achieving 80% coverage? And what you find is SigmaScheduling. So these plots, they're trying to compare these both approaches on fair ground, saying, hey, of course, you could say, hey, how do I know if I should set it at -3, -1? It depends on the application, right? And depends on the individual's desire for how much coverage they want. Okay, well, vary the fixed duration. Send it 6 hours before, 5 hours before, 4 hours before, 3 hours before, and so on, and create this plot based on past data. And do the same for C across all individuals, right? The uncertainty is varying, but that critical value is staying fixed. And now you create these same curves again. And what we find is, yes, SigmaScheduling does outperform the status quo. If we want, for the same, we get more bang for our buck. For the same mean delay from potential intervention to brush time, you get a higher proportion of your sample with your desired coverage. And that takes place across coverage values, unless you are, and that's the point I make here, the more coverage you want, the more important it is to consider uncertainty, which makes complete sense, right? If you are okay making a bunch of mistakes, then you really don't need to be looking at variability or uncertainty because you're okay making mistakes. But the less and less the more and more you care about making correct decisions, the more and more important it is to account for uncertainty in those predictions to inform your decisions. And so, yeah, if you're okay with only getting 50% of individuals' data usable from an analysis perspective for your MRT, I could keep plotting these, and you can imagine if you see the trend, status quo probably does pretty similar to SigmaScheduling. But you try and go above 70% even, just 70%. So we're talking about like some feasibility studies are looking just 66%. You got to use some approach that's better than the status quo, at least in this setting. And so we took this a step further. We said, hey, well, okay, that's with user-provided times, but what if we were using a machine learning algorithm to try and predict brush times? And so we use this online Bayesian linear regression algorithm. Very simple, no deep learning, nothing super fancy, but an algorithm that's interpretable and we know will converge, will learn quickly with a limited amount of data from that individual himself. And what does online Bayesian linear regression look like? Imagine you have some underlying truth, some target of where the parameters should be, this weight 1, weight 0. And what you're doing is basically, as you collect more and more data, you're getting closer and closer to that target. And what that implies, what that means is that basically what you're doing is you're making predictions given some features about a particular, let's say, brush time. You're saying, hey, when is that brush time? 4 a.m., 4:30, 5 a.m.? And you're not just reporting the mean brush time, but as you become more and more certain in your parameters, your uncertainty decreases and decreases. So as you collect more and more data, your algorithm becomes more and more certain in its predictions of that brush time. And so you can use that information in the same way with SigmaScheduling. And so you could use this with any machine learning predictions, as long as you have some quantification of uncertainty. And again, what we find is these results hold. When you're dealing with machine learning based predictions as well, again, you find that SigmaScheduling outperforms the status quo. And of course, you could take a look at the paper for more discussion and details there. But I want to get back to this in practice question here, right? So great, we show that whatever C you choose, if you want more than 70% of your data covered, you should be using this approach compared to status quo. So now how do we actually choose this? Well, there's really two perspectives that I'm going to highlight, and then I'm going to end with this conclusion. Remember that we're dealing with predictive probability distributions here. So we're dealing with this idea of saying, hey, I want to not only just guess the mean of where this behavior is going to take place. I think my mean prediction is 5 a.m. I think it's going to happen at 5 a.m. I'm also forming a probability distribution. Any sort of probability distribution, I can sit there and say, oh, if I go this value of C1, so like if I go -1, if I use the value C equals -1 in this probability distribution, I can literally compute, given a probability distribution, how much the probability is of preceding the target behavior or coming after the target behavior if you're going in the right direction, right? You're going rightwards. So I can sit there and say, oh, if I go -1, my C equals -1, my probability of covering the desired behavior, well, looks like it's going to be 80%. That's really how you should think about this from a theoretical perspective. I'm just dealing with probability distributions, and I'm trying to get my desired probability underneath the curve. Think about it this way, and this is going to give us a little more intuition that I'm going to show in a sec. Just like when you're doing statistical testing, that's of course a different type of distribution. That's not a predictive distribution, but just like when you're doing statistical testing, if I say, hey, I'm going to go -2 standard deviations to the left, I'm going to get 97% or whatever the probability is of making sure that whatever I'm detecting is truly what I'm detecting. In the same way here. And that's exactly what I want to show, is that actually if you end up using participant provided times, and then you just look at past residuals from standard error, the exact example I provided, you're dealing with students' t distribution. And guess what? If you remember those awful tables you had to look at back in your statistics course or probability course or whatever biostatistics course, you can literally look and say, oh, I just need to use a critical value of t of -1 or -2 to get my desired. I want 90% coverage, 80% coverage, 70% coverage. I literally can just choose that c value or the t in that case from a table, or you can of course ask ChatGPT nowadays. And then we have the Gaussian posterior distribution. The critical value is just a z-score. Okay, I want 1.96. My C is going to be 1.96. Wow, I get this 97 or whatever coverage, 97% coverage. Or I can set my my C to be 0.5, -0.5, and say, okay, well, I'm going to now have 80% or 60% coverage or whatever. And you can, of course, just again ask ChatGPT, I want this desired coverage. What would be my z-score to get this on a standard Gaussian distribution? But of course, you shouldn't just be looking at a theoretical perspective. If you have prior data, you can actually choose C also from an empirical perspective, because there's a trade-off, as I told you. You might want a desired coverage, but maybe you're not happy with the delay. Maybe you want 90% of your participants to have 80% coverage. That says, oh my God, I'm gonna have to send my interventions 3.5 hours before on average. Maybe you're not happy with that. Maybe you want 70% of your participants to have 80% coverage. Okay, then I'm gonna send it 3 hours before. And depending on your application and how irregular behavior is, these curves will look different, but you're again making this trade-off. And so this is an empirical perspective based on past data, like I showed you already in this talk. But of course, our recommendation is not to follow either. I think you should consider both. You should think, okay, well, based on the theoretical probability distributions, I should get this much coverage. But then looking at past data, I'm not sure if I'm okay with that delay. Let me be okay with a little less coverage in exchange for shorter delays and so on and so forth. And that should be your expert informed decision. So trust your own domain knowledge when choosing that C for your MRTs or your JITAIs. And with that, that's the SigmaScheduling approach, is taking these predictions, using measures of uncertainty to make better informed decisions of when you would even schedule decision points. And that's what I want to emphasize here, is that really my parting thoughts is that even for something as simple as just scheduling decision points, so we haven't even talked about reinforcement learning, just scheduling decision points, you see that uncertainty really plays a large role in improving the performance of and the ability to cover the desired target behavior in this specific case. And I can imagine in many different situations, you can imagine where things are going to be fallible because predictions are fallible because there's highly irregular behavior, eating, sleeping, so on and so forth. If you're scheduling interventions based on some target behavior and you're relying on an individual reporting that, and that's variable, you should consider SigmaScheduling. But of course, where to go next? Of course, consider these other behaviors, but then we really want to know how this works deployed in real life, not just looking at past data, but also in real life. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, is we're deploying this on board on Oralytics V2. And that's a collaborative effort with the folks that I mentioned earlier in my talk. And that this is really exciting. We're going to see how things play out. And with that, I will take any questions that we have. Yeah, there you go.
That was very nice. Awesome.
Okay. Thanks,
Very
Santosh.
nicely done.
Okay.
All right. So let me first open this up to the group before I ask my question. Are there any questions from the group? I know we are over time, so we'll try to keep it.
Sorry about that.
Anyone has a burning question? So let me ask one then, while others are thinking. How do you balance the uncertainty in forecast with the uncertainty in the current state? So when you're trying to make a decision, do I intervene or not intervene? You have a limited budget. So in that limited budget, you are trying to decide, do I spend that budget now, or do I keep this budget for later? So there is some uncertainty in the current state. There is some uncertainty in the forecast, depending upon what you have. Or are you just using not thinking about the forecast uncertainty right now?
So this problem is really focused actually on that forecasting uncertainty, because you can't necessarily rely. This is a great question. So you can't necessarily rely on detecting whether the individual is brushing or not. You really have to try and forecast when the individual is likely to brush. So you have this situation where just to schedule decision points in the decision point scheduling space, I think, to answer your question more directly, really, and then I'll give a sort of more comprehensive answer. We're really dealing oftentimes with forecasting, because you want to know when to even make a decision using a reinforcement learning algorithm or something simpler, decision rules, whatever you want to use to decide between potential intervention options. You have to sit here and say, oh, I think the person is going to brush at 8 a.m. Right now it's 7 a.m. I think they're going to brush at 8 a.m. If I think they're going to brush at 8 a.m., how uncertain am I? And then accordingly, I'm going to schedule that decision point, because maybe you're not going to be able to make those predictions every second. So you're always going to have this situation is, oh, well, has the person brushed yet? No, they haven't brushed yet. Okay, I really need the probability of them brushing within the next hour is really high. Okay, let me schedule that decision point. For Oralytics specifically, one of the logistical challenges is Santosh, I don't have to explain to you, but maybe to the audience, that I think one of the difficulties when dealing with just-in-time adaptive interventions is there's a lot of back-end software engineering that's required to really get this all to work. And what I mean by that is, and I can go to that slide really quick, there's so many components that are involved in getting this to work. Why am I mentioning that? I'm mentioning that because being able to make those predictions on the fly, like every second or every minute, requires that you collect this data, you upload the data to the server, you're using that information to make predictions. That oftentimes is not feasible. So for Oralytics V1, the data was only available, made available once a night. And so the data from the previous days made available once a night, and then you don't get any data again until the next night. Well, hey, that means as soon as you get the data from the previous night, you have to already actually forecast when the person is going to brush at. You're forecasting at 4 a.m. whether the person's going to brush at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., and so on. And accordingly, that forecasting uncertainty is exactly what we're dealing with here, to be very precise. I like this question because we're really dealing with forecasting uncertainty. If you don't know when something is going to happen in the future, how do you account for that uncertainty and make better decisions? And in this case, schedule decision points. Current state. That is an interesting situation where oftentimes that's exactly the focus of my work on the reinforcement learning side, is even when we're dealing with a situation where we're estimating someone's current state, let's say how stressed the individual is, and you have some model that you know is not so accurate. Now you're saying, well, hey, I need to know what decision I need to make right now, but I don't know really what state the person is in. Again, you have now a different type of uncertainty where now you have a model that's predicting forward, and that's exactly the complexity that you're talking about, Santosh. And that's why I wanted to wait for this comprehensive answer, but is you have a model that's forecasting the effects of a potential intervention. So you have this uncertainty, but then you also have the uncertainty in the state estimate itself at the current moment, which again, and disentangling these sources of uncertainty is exactly what I'm looking at. So for example, one of the ways you can think is propagation, right? So if you have a model that's dependent on state, you have state estimation uncertainty. So that's one form of uncertainty. And for those in the audience familiar, you can propagate this uncertainty through to the forecast of what reward you're going to get or what cost you're going to get from an intervention. So that sort of gives you a sneak peek into how you would balance the two sort of huge components of uncertainty in these predictions. Yeah, this is a great question. Awesome. I think you guys got this slide. So I'm just going to switch back so I can see people's faces. Okay, cool. Maybe I'll stop sharing.
I see there's one question in the chat. Shaheen, can you read the question or ask the participant to read it?
Certainly. We have a question from Jixon Lee. Have you thought about adjusting the centered usual time based on data collected in addition to the uncertainty score? And for our participants, you can now come off of mute. So if you have a question.
This is a great question. So we did, but I didn't show it here. So great. So my direct answer is yes, we did. My more comprehensive answer is why didn't I show that here? What I wanted to show here is a fair comparison. I'm just taking the prediction, and I'm just going to use the prediction and some measure of uncertainty or a fixed duration, and I'm just going to compare them apples to apples. So I'm going to use the same centering point, exactly to your point. I'm going to use the same centering point because I want to make sure that I'm making a fair comparison. And so that's why the results I showed you today are really, I didn't correct for that centering, for the user provided times. And I'll get to the Bayesian linear regression in a sec. But the user provided times, I'm not correcting exactly as you caught. I'm just figuring out how far away from that centering point should I schedule the decision point. And that was just to show from an analysis perspective, just to show you that there's a benefit for Sigma scheduling almost regardless, or depending on the quality of the uncertainty quantification, right? So there's technical details I'm happy to discuss offline. But user provided times, not correcting, and what I mean by correcting is even if you use that online Bayesian linear regression, the online Bayesian linear regression is correcting for differences in centering, right? Because it is using multiple features, it's looking at past errors, and it's actually moving the prediction itself versus the participant provided times. To your point, I didn't correct for that, but you could. Because a prediction interval, exactly, the mean value. So I just looked at the standard error value for the prediction interval, which is based on the standard deviation of previous residuals. But you could, again, exactly, take the mean of previous residuals and correct accordingly. And I have results there. You again show improvements compared to user profile, compared to both. Thanks for the question. Great, awesome. Glad I answered your question.
Okay, given that we are way over time, so I would like to be respectful of everyone's time. Let's thank Asim for a great webinar, and good luck with this research.
Thanks so much, Santosh. Thanks, Shine. Take care, everyone. Thanks for your time.